On a computer screen at the University of Bern in Switzerland, a research team spent months doing something that had never been attempted quite this way before, feeding an entire millennium of Southern California's earthquake history into a physics-based model, reconstructing century by century exactly how much stress has been building on two of the state's most dangerous faults. When the model finished running, the number it produced wasn't just high. It was the highest reading for this specific stretch of fault anywhere in the entire 1,000-year reconstruction. Not the highest in decades, not the highest since the last major earthquake. The highest point of accumulated stress documented on the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems in 1,000 years of geologic history. I need you to understand exactly what that means and exactly what it doesn't mean, because this is one of those stories where both the real science and the honest caveats matter enormously. An international research team published this finding on June 3rd in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth. And alongside the headline stress number, they introduced a genuinely new concept that helps explain not just how big California's next major earthquake could be, but specifically what could make it far worse than anyone previously modeled. They're calling it an earthquake gate, and it sits at a specific mountain pass just northeast of Los Angeles that millions of people drive through without a second thought. So today, we're going to walk through exactly what this new model found, what an earthquake gate actually is, why the current stress pattern specifically resembles conditions that have preceded some of the region's worst historical earthquakes, and what the researchers themselves say this genuinely does and doesn't tell us about when the next big one might actually arrive. Let's start with how this study actually worked, because the methodology matters here. The research team, led by Liliane Burkhardt, constructed what's called a physics-based earthquake. Cycle model, essentially a detailed simulation that recreates how stress builds, transfers, and releases across a fault system over time, grounded in the actual physical laws governing how rock deforms and fractures under pressure. They then fed that model 1,000 years of reconstructed earthquake history along the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems in Southern California, using the same kind of paleoseismic evidence, buried fault scarps, offset geologic layers, radiocarbon-dated sediment that seismologists have used for decades to reconstruct a region's earthquake past long before modern instruments existed. Running that reconstructed history through a physics-based model let the team produce something genuinely new, a continuous 1,000-year timeline of exactly how stress has accumulated and released across this fault system all the way up through today. And today's reading, according to their model, sits higher than any point across that entire millennium. To understand why that matters, you need a basic grasp of how earthquakes actually work at the level of physics. Faults like the San Andreas and San Jacinto mark boundaries, where two enormous sections of the Earth's crust are grinding past each other, but friction holds them locked together most of the time, rather than letting them slide smoothly. As the surrounding tectonic plates continue moving regardless, stress builds up steadily in the rock around that locked fault, like a spring being slowly wound tighter and tighter. Eventually, that stress exceeds what friction can hold, and the fault suddenly slips, releasing all that stored energy at once as an earthquake. A model that can actually quantify how much stress has built up in measurable physical units gives scientists something considerably more concrete than the vague general sense of this fault is overdue that's dominated public conversation about California earthquakes for decades. Now let's get to the part of this study that genuinely breaks new ground, the earthquake gate. In Southern California, the San Andreas Fault and the San Jacinto Fault are the two most significant structures accommodating the bulk of the tectonic plate motion moving through the region. For most of their length, they run as separate, distinct fault systems. But northeast of Los Angeles, at a location called Cajon Pass, the two faults approach each other closely enough that they form a genuinely complex tectonic junction, close enough that a rupture beginning on one fault could, under the right conditions, jump across and continue rupturing along the other. The research teams specifically singled out this junction as what they're calling an earthquake gate, a term meant to capture exactly the function this location appears to serve, a kind of decision point that determines whether a future major earthquake stays confined to a single fault or spreads across both fault systems simultaneously, turning what might otherwise be a serious but geographically contained earthquake into something considerably larger and more destructive. The research team's analysis of the region's earthquake history found something genuinely striking when they looked specifically at how past ruptures have behaved at this exact junction. Using detailed rupture modeling built on prior published research into the region's maximum credible rupture extents, they were able to reconstruct a timeline of what they describe as gate-open and gate-closed events throughout the historical record, essentially cataloging which past earthquakes stopped right at Cajon Pass, staying confined to whichever single fault they started on, and which past earthquakes instead blew straight through the junction, rupturing across both the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems together in a single, larger combined event. That historical pattern gives scientists something to actually compare today's conditions against, rather than just speculating in the abstract about what could happen. And here's the finding that gives this study its genuinely unsettling edge. The current stress pattern the model calculated closely resembles the specific conditions that preceded some of the region's largest historical earthquakes, the ones where the gate was open, where past ruptures didn't stay confined to a single fault, but instead swept across both systems together. That's a meaningfully different and more specific kind of warning than the general, "a big earthquake is overdue," framing Californians have heard for years. This new model isn't just saying stress is high, it's saying the specific pattern of that stress, mapped in against the historical record at this one critical junction, looks like the setup that's preceded the biggest, most combined, most destructive earthquakes this exact fault system has produced before. It's worth grounding this in the region's actual earthquake history to understand just how long it's genuinely been since anything like that happened. The last major earthquake to significantly affect the wider Los Angeles region was the Fort Tejon earthquake of 1857, an estimated magnitude 7.9 event that ruptured a substantial stretch of the southern San Andreas Fault. That's 169 years ago, a genuinely long, quiet stretch for a fault system this significant. And it's precisely the kind of long, silent interval that lets stress accumulate to the record levels this new study has now documented. I want to be careful with the word overdue here, the same way we've been careful with it on this channel before, because a long, quiet stretch doesn't function like an overdue library book with a fixed deadline. It means this fault system has had an unusually long window to accumulate stress without releasing it through a major rupture, which the physics of the situation says has to eventually change, without telling us the specific day, year, or even decade that change will actually arrive. This new, highly specific finding about Cajon Pass also connects directly to a broader shift that's already reshaped how California's official earthquake forecasts work. The state's most authoritative long-term earthquake model, known as UCRF3, revised its estimate for the likelihood of a magnitude 8 or larger earthquake striking California within the next 30 years upward, from about 4.7% under the previous version of the model to about 7.0% under the current one. The specific reason for that increase was the inclusion of multi-fault ruptures in the updated modeling, scenarios where an earthquake isn't confined to a single individual fault, but instead jumps across connected fault segments, producing a larger combined event than either fault could produce on its own. That's precisely the mechanism this new University of Bern-led study has now identified a specific physical location for. Cajon Pass isn't just an interesting geological curiosity. It's a concrete, mappable example of exactly the kind of multi-fault linkage point that pushed California's own official earthquake probability estimates upward in the first place. And this new research gives scientists a genuinely more precise, physics-based picture of how primed that specific junction currently is. I want to make sure I give you the honest, complete version of what this study actually claims, because the research team themselves have been direct and careful about the limits of their own findings. Burkhardt, the study's lead researcher, stated plainly that the study is not a prediction of when an earthquake will occur. She's been explicit that this work functions as a planning tool rather than a forecast, a way of giving emergency planners, structural engineers, and government agencies a sharper, more physics-grounded picture of exactly how stressed this fault system currently is, and where the greatest structural uncertainty in a future rupture's path actually sits, rather than a countdown clock ticking toward some specific future date. In practical terms, that means this model becomes genuinely useful for things like deciding where to prioritize seismic retrofitting funds, where to stage emergency supplies in advance, and which specific evacuation and response scenarios deserve the most detailed advance planning, precisely because the Cajon Pass area now has a documented physics-based reason to be treated as a particularly consequential piece of the regional puzzle. It's worth putting this new finding alongside the broader body of work Southern California emergency planners have already been building around for years, because this study doesn't exist in isolation. Back in 2008, seismologists, including Dr. Lucy Jones at Caltech, helped develop a detailed simulation of a magnitude 7.8 rupture along the San Andreas Fault, a scenario that modeled nearly 2 minutes of continuous shaking and projected hundreds of deaths, along with billions of dollars in damage across the region. Jones has been direct about a specific blind spot she believes the public consistently underestimates in these scenarios. "We underestimate the social disruption and the economic disruption," she said. "We are so focused on our fear of dying that we forget to be afraid of being bankrupted." That's a genuinely important point to sit with alongside this new stress research, because a scenario where the earthquake gate at Cajon Pass stays open, where a rupture spreads across both the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems together rather than staying confined to one, would almost certainly push the damage and disruption estimates from that original 2008 scenario considerably higher, both in terms of the physical shaking and, per Jones's own point, in terms of the far messier, longer-lasting economic and social recovery that would follow. So what happens next, both scientifically and practically? On the research side, expect continued refinement of this physics-based stress model as more paleoseismic data and updated rupture modeling become available, along with more detailed follow-up work specifically focused on the Cajon Pass junction itself, given how central it's now shown to be in determining a future earthquake's ultimate scale. Seismologists will also likely be watching seismicity patterns, specifically around this junction more closely going forward, looking for any subtle changes in the background rate or character of smaller earthquakes in that specific area that might offer additional clues about the fault's current behavior, the same kind of careful ongoing monitoring we've discussed on this channel with other actively studied fault systems. On the planning side, this kind of physics-based, spatially specific stress model gives California's emergency management and structural engineering communities something genuinely more actionable than a broad, statewide probability figure, knowing that one specific junction functions as a potential gate between two major fault systems, and knowing that current conditions there resemble the historical pattern preceding the region's largest combined ruptures, gives planners a concrete reason to prioritize seismic retrofitting, infrastructure hardening, and detailed evacuation planning, specifically for the communities sitting in and around that Cajon Pass corridor, stretching from the San Bernardino area through the broader Inland Empire, rather than treating the entire region's earthquake risk as a single undifferentiated statistic. If you live anywhere in Southern California, and particularly if you live in or near the San Bernardino and inland Empire region closest to Cajon Pass itself, here's what actually matters from this research. First, understand that this study genuinely doesn't tell us anything about timing, and treating it as evidence that an earthquake is coming this year, or even this decade specifically, would be reading considerably more certainty into the findings than the researchers themselves claim. Second, take it as a legitimate, physics-grounded reason to make sure your own household earthquake preparedness is genuinely current. A stocked emergency kit, a clear household plan for drop, cover, and hold on, and the MyShake app installed for Shake Alert early warning coverage. Third, if you own an older home or building anywhere in the broader Southern California region, particularly one that hasn't been evaluated for seismic retrofitting, this is a genuinely reasonable moment to look into it, given that this new research specifically strengthens the case that a future rupture here could plausibly be larger and more combined than some existing planning scenarios have assumed. And fourth, follow how California's official hazard planning agencies respond to this research over the coming months, since findings like this one, once absorbed into future updates of the state's broader earthquake forecasting models, tend to translate directly into updated building codes, insurance risk assessments, and public safety guidance over time, even though that process itself typically unfolds over years rather than overnight. So here's where this stands as of today. A new physics-based model built by an international research team has found that stress on Southern California's San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems currently sits at its highest documented level in 1,000 years, and has identified Cajon Pass, the junction where these two major faults meet northeast of Los Angeles, as a critical earthquake gate that could determine whether a future rupture stays confined to one fault or spreads across both simultaneously. The current stress pattern specifically resembles the conditions that preceded some of the region's largest historical multi-fault earthquakes, a genuinely more specific and concerning signal than a simple, general sense that the region is overdue. The researchers themselves are careful to note this isn't a prediction of timing, but a planning tool, one that gives emergency managers, engineers, and residents alike a sharper, more precise picture of exactly how prime this specific stretch of California's fault network has become, and exactly where the greatest uncertainty about a future rupture's ultimate size actually sits. I'll be watching for any follow-up research specifically targeting the Cajon Pass junction, and I'll keep tracking how this new stress model gets incorporated into California's broader official earthquake hazard planning over the coming months. If breakdowns like this help you understand the real, nuanced science behind a headline this consequential, rather than just the scariest possible version of it, subscribe, because I'll have the update the moment this picture meaningfully shifts. I'll see you in the next one.